Hello everyone. For the 3 people who end up watching this video, I welcome you. This is Erik, the Asian movie enthusiast. So despite the Dario Argento Suspiria type lighting I'm using tonight, we will not be reviewing Italian horror movies right now. We're reviewing Asian horror movies. But I need some type of atmosphere. It's a dark and stormy, snowy night tonight, so may as well go all the way. Now, all of the introduction videos are out of the way, so we can finally begin the Asian Horror Year in Review project. Now, the first era we're going to cover is 1926 to 1969. So this will be a 3-part video that will cover 43 Asian horror movies released during this period. Now, most of these movies will be Japanese. And remember, all of the titles for the movies that I review will be listed in the description box below. So let's get started. Got a lot to do. So we'll begin with the only pre-1954 Asian horror movie I've ever seen, and that is A Page of Madness from 1926. Now this movie is one of those films that I enjoy recommending whenever I can because it's very unorthodox and interesting. It's a silent film about a man who takes a job at an asylum with the hopes of freeing his imprisoned wife. So if you look on Wikipedia, it basically says that the film itself is the product of an avant-garde group of artists in Japan known as the Shinkankakuha, or School of New Perceptions. We're already getting weird here. Who try to overcome naturalistic representation in their works. So, from that description alone, you may suspect that this will be very experimental in its style, and that it would rely less on linear storytelling, and you would be correct in that assumption. But fortunately, it actually works really well, because it depicts madness in really interesting ways. So if you're someone who likes weird, abstract films, then I would say that this is actually a high priority film to check out. Overall, it uses a grainy video quality. I mean, it's a film from 1926, and I don't think it had a huge budget, so it's kind of automatic in this case. But it also uses some bizarre camera work and direction that adds to the strange mood, especially the few dancing scenes and a few shots that are actually from the patient's point of view. There are no intertitles, so there's no descriptions on a blank screen in between scenes. So the film uses imagery alone to demonstrate the madness of the characters. The scoring consists of ambient sounds and is really freaking creepy. I'm sure when it was, well, I'm not sure, but I suspect that when it was originally shown in cinemas in the 20s, that it was probably accompanied by live narration. So they'll have a person actually in the theater narrating it for you, with maybe some actual live music as well. So I'm not sure where the music exactly came from on the print that exists today. I assume somebody set a score to it. But whoever did it did a very good job, because it adds a weird, almost hypnotic, creepy vibe to the whole thing. So I personally think this movie is very absorbing from start to finish. I think it's really good stuff. Now, one fun fact about this movie is that even though it was made in the 20s, it was actually lost for 45 years until it was found again by the director in his storehouse in the early 70s. So I'm not sure how it was lost and how he eventually found it, but one aspect that comes from this is that there was a chunk of film stock that was lost permanently. So what we have today is a film that's not completely whole. It's an incomplete film, but it still works really well due to its abstract nature. So it's really kind of fascinating stuff. It's a weird film. I mean, any normal film with a linear storyline, if you lose a chunk of the film stock, the film's probably not going to work. But because this was non-linear and experimental, even if you lose a few pieces, it still works. So it's pretty interesting. So for DVD availability, this is not widely available on DVD. It has no official US release that I know of, but it is streaming on YouTube. so feel free to check that out. There might be a few DVDs floating around, but I haven't been able to find too many as of late. So, if you don't know what you're in for when watching this YouTube channel, you may have an idea now. So the first film I cover is an obscure experimental Japanese horror film from 1926. So enjoy. I strongly recommend it if you're somebody who likes weird abstract films. If you don't, you might be lukewarm to it. So now we have to fast forward, unfortunately, 28 years to our next Asian horror film. Now, as I mentioned in my intro video for this playlist, I suspect that this gap in time is due primarily to low horror movie production, coupled with a lack of availability for the horror movies that were actually made during the first half of the 20th century. But don't worry, because this is the first and the last significant gap in our exploration of Asian horror, so we're not going to have any huge gaps in time anymore. Now, our second movie that we're going to cover here is one that almost everyone has heard of, and that is Godzilla from 1954, also known as Gojira. So, if you're unaware of the plot of the original film, since there have been so many of them, basically Japan is invaded by a massive, dinosaur-like creature, and this film was directed by Ishiro Honda, by the way. So, Godzilla is about 170 feet tall, and it has evolved from an ancient sea creature. So I think the premise was that he was awakened from his deep underwater slumber by underwater atomic bomb testing. So overall, this film, not unlike A Page of Madness, uses kind of a dim, grainy, black and white cinematography that's actually quite suited for a film of this type, because it makes the special effects look a little bit better than maybe some of the colored sequels and spin-offs that would show up in the 60s and 70s. I mean, some of the special effects in those movies are real dodgy. The first one, the special effects have aged a bit, but they're still pretty effective. Now, Godzilla himself looks pretty mean here. He's got these demented, white eyeballs, or I remember his eyeballs. I don't remember exactly what color, but I remember they were kind of demented. And that works. One highlight moment is an on-land rampage sequence, which lasts 15 minutes. That's very effective. And, it's just entertaining to watch him just, stomp and flame throughout Tokyo. Now, there's some very memorable death scenes as well. One of which befalls a group of reporters in a broadcasting tower, so look out for that one. So I definitely recommend this one, and it's practically a must-see. The DVD availability on this is widely available, so it's available on Amazon, a lot of DVD sites. But one thing to keep in mind is that there was an American version of this that almost splices in new American scenes into the old movie, and it just it kind of just butchers the movie up. And you'll know that version because I think it's entitled The King of the Monsters. So stay away from the King of the Monsters version and just watch the original Gojira version, which is by far the superior film. So, some Godzilla fans do believe that the original Gojira film is the best film of the franchise. I disagree with that. I do think that some of the other future titles are actually better. Or even if they're not exactly better, they might be even more purely entertaining. And speaking of the other Godzilla films, just to throw this out there, this will be the only Godzilla film that I will include in this Asian horror series, because the vast majority of the subsequent installments I personally classify as action and or comedy movies. They're sci-fi movies, but they're action comedies to me. There are a few exceptions. Some of them do get a little dark again. But I don't want to get off track here with too much sci-fi action comedy. This is our Asian horror series. But don't worry, because I do plan on doing a Godzilla filmography video or a couple videos at some point in the future where I will give my brief thoughts on every Godzilla film. That was a really fun project I did a few years ago on that. So we'll get to that in the future. So the next film that we're going to cover here is another film by Ishiro Honda, the director of Godzilla. This film is called Half Human from 1955. Now, this film is basically about a Yeti that terrorizes people on Mount Fuji. Sounds great, not so much. The Japanese version is told in flashbacks that are framed by scenes of a reporter questioning this expedition after they've returned from their harrowing journey into the mountains. So basically it's about, 5 young friends who go to the Japanese Alps for a skiing vacation, and they're terrorized by this thing. I have seen this film at times on some best of lists on the internet. I disagree with that. Personally, I think this is kind of a lower grade, dull B movie. It's not really suspenseful or interesting to watch. There are some nice natural environments to enjoy, but it's kind of a limp and unimpressive film overall. Do make sure that you watch the uncut Japanese version, which is actually the version that's more difficult to find, because for some reason, again, against these odd DVD distribution things, apparently some Japanese people were offended by the depiction of some of the village people. Apparently they were offended that they were portrayed as, degenerates or something like that, so some of the releases cut some of the scenes of them out of the film. But I actually watched the original Japanese version of this, but it didn't have subtitles. So you might have to choose between the two. But in any case, I would not really recommend this movie. It's not very good. In terms of Ishiro Honda in general, just my thoughts, I think that he's a very inconsistent director. He's made a lot of underwhelming movies, and I don't enjoy his films quite as much as other people do. However, on a side note, 2 of my favorite Honda films are ones that are rarely mentioned, and those are Yog, Monster from Space from 1970 and War of the Gargantuas from 1966. Some of those are actually pretty cheesy, but I find those to be highly entertaining. So that's my opinion on Half Human. I didn't really care for it. The next film on our list is a film called The Ghost of Kasane Swamp from 1957. Now, this is a big moment for us, because this is our introduction to the samurai horror subgenre of horror. This subgenre, we'll see, and you're going to see this, is a genre that Japan explored thoroughly during this time period. There was a lot of these movies that are produced, and we're going to cover a bunch of them coming up here. So the plot of this movie, The Ghost of Kasane Swamp, is that after being brutally murdered by a samurai, a man's spirit haunts the neighboring village to exact his vengeance. Now, I think this one is a cool flick for a few different reasons. First, the camera work uses some simplistic but very effective techniques during the hauntings that emphasize trickery and misdirection. So it's interesting to see the different methods that the ghost uses to accomplish his goals. These methods would be used frequently in other samurai horror films that followed, as we'll see. In terms of overall quality, I thought the acting was spot on, and the short running time of 67 minutes helps to keep things moving. There's not a whole lot of filler in this. It moves in a nice pace. This is actually one of the first samurai horror films that I ever saw, so it kind of holds a special place in my heart. But it's actually a good starter. If you haven't seen a samurai horror film before, The Ghost of Kasane Swamp is a good one to start with. Now, this one is difficult to find. I don't even remember where I saw it. I probably saw it on YouTube years ago, but I wasn't able to find it recently when I looked. So put it on your to-see list and look out for it. When it pops up again, check it out. Now the next film is called The Ghost Story of the Seven Wonders of Honsho. How about that title? It's also known as The Ghost Stories of Wanderer at Honsho. I'm not sure that's correct English grammar, but whatever. From 1957. So, in this one, basically an honorable old man establishes a friendship with a tanuki, which is a raccoon spirit. But when conflict presents itself in the form of a conniving visitor, the tanuki helps to restore justice. So this is a pretty good, again, samurai ghost film that uses the cliche tricks of the era, such as tricking the antagonist to do things. But there are some very brief cameos of popular yokai monsters that liven things up and make it a little bit memorable. You know, overall, if the yokai monsters were not in this movie, it would just be kind of an okay movie. But because the yokai monsters pop up, it makes it a little bit more interesting to watch. So, if you're unfamiliar with yokai, okay, in Japanese folklore, there are tons of yokai. So they're basically supernatural monsters and spirits. I highly recommend the book Yokai Attack, the Japanese Survival Guide, which provides details on around like 50 or so traditional yokai monsters. Every time I go to Japan for vacation, I always bring that book with me and I reread it because it's so entertaining. So I recommend that just to get your feet wet and understand what the yokai are all about. It's great stuff for any fan of Japanese horror mythology. Now, the yokai that's featured in the Seven Wonders of Honsho, the tanuki, is one of the most popular. And it has some hilarious mythology aspects that the movie doesn't exactly cover, but I'll let you figure those out for yourself. Now, this one, unfortunately, like the Ghost of Kasane Swamp, is difficult to find. So put it on your to-watch list and look out for it. The next movie is called The Mansion of the Ghost Cat, also known as Black Cat Mansion, from 1958. Again, another Japanese horror movie. So far, every movie we've covered has been Japanese. This is another one. So in this one, a married couple travel to a desolate mansion to tour it before they move in. But the misdeeds of their ancestors haunt the premises. So the brief opening and the brief ending scenes are set in the 1950s, and they're filmed in black and white, while the middle section consists of a very long flashback that's set in samurai times. What else? And that section is filmed in color. So there's kind of an interesting style to this movie. Now, again, samurai theme, major trend in Japanese horror during the 50s and 60s. But this trend at its worst can be less interesting and diverse than even the Ghost Girl films that we see to a certain degree in contemporary Japanese horror films. And we know how everybody loves to complain about those. So if you watch a lot of Japanese horror films from the 50s and 60s, you'll notice the cliches popping up. The black and white scenes are pretty good in this movie, the beginning and the end. But the big historical segment, I did not like it. I thought it really kind of tanked the film with some overacting. I did not like the acting in this. There's some really intrusive scoring that doesn't work. And, you know, the storyline is very generic for the era of Japanese horror. So you're better off sticking with some of the other ones that I'm recommending and giving this one a pass. The death scenes, I gotta say this, are really stupid. And I'm not even going to get into the details on them. They're really bad. So I would not recommend The Mansion of the Ghost Cat. Next on our list here is Mother Tree from 1958, another Japanese horror film. And guess what? A samurai is in it. Can you see a theme here? So, a samurai is haunted by spirits after raping a woman and killing innocent people. Well, this guy apparently is going to get what he deserves. This one is only 48 minutes long, but unlike the Ghost of Kasane Swamp, which had a short runtime that benefited it, this one, the short runtime really hurts it because it feels rushed and exaggerated with no character development whatsoever. The mythos that they use to surround the fantastical elements is very bland, and the acting is weak. The horror scenes, there's a few decent ones, but there's some that are terrible too. I mean, there's a scene near the end where there's like a drunken stupor involved. It was just like, it doesn't work. So you see when a cliche in a film industry is established, it tends to wear thin pretty fast when execution falters. For me personally, if you give me something creative and weird, I'm more likely to forgive lackluster execution. But when you serve me a cliche with lackluster execution, I could get pretty irritated, and that's the case with Mother Tree. It's kind of sandwiched in an era where better films of its kind are littered around it. So I would skip this one if I were you. Now the next one is a big one. This is a big film. It's one of the better samurai era Japanese horror films of this series, or I guess this period of years that we're covering, and that is the Ghost of Yotsuya from 1959. So the Ghost of Yotsuya, this is probably, I'm not exaggerating, the most popular Japanese ghost story of all time. If you go to literature, to stage plays, to movies, to books, it's everywhere. It was actually originally a stage play, I think, that appeared in the early 1800s, but it has been adapted a lot during the past few hundred years. Now, I've seen a few websites that have claimed that there are at least 20 Yotsuya film adaptations and or remakes that predate this one. So there were apparently like 20 or more Yotsuya films that were made before 1959, very few of which are available. I think I saw one or two of them, but they were more like dramas, so I'm not including them in this review series. But I've only seen a few of them, so apparently there's a whole bunch out there. I'm not sure if they exist anymore, though. Some of them, again, like I say, were probably destroyed or lost during World War II. But in any case, this version from 1959 is probably the most popular version, so it's probably the one to watch first. It is directed by a man named Nobuo Nakagawa, who also directed The Ghost of Kasane Swamp, as well as a handful of other horror films such as The Lady Vampire from 1959, which we'll get to. But The Ghost of Yotsuya is probably his best film. So you have the most popular version of the most popular ghost story of all time, and it's probably this particular director's best film. So this is one to check out here. So what's the plot of Yotsuya? So it's basically about an overly ambitious samurai and the hauntings he experiences. So he's basically this guy, he wants to marry a woman, he's obsessed with her, but her father refuses. So what does he do? He secretly kills the father and then marries his daughter. But after a while, because this guy's such a jerk, he gets tired of the wife, becomes interested in another lady. So he hatches another dubious plan to get what he wants. So within like the first 20 minutes of this movie, it's obvious that this guy is a freaking jerk, you know? But much of the first half is spent on developing the antagonist and the conflicts, gives a little depth to it. And then the second half kind of turns to the supernatural events. The execution, I think, is very good in this. It also elicits some emotion from the viewer as well. And the horror sequences are actually pretty stylish and well executed. There are actually some beautiful shots to behold, too. So I definitely recommend this one. The Ghost of Yotsuya from 1959. Now, DVD availability, it's not widely available on DVD. You can find it, but it is streaming on Hulu, so feel free to watch it there. Alright, so the next film on this list that we're covering is The Lady Vampire. So 20 years after her disappearance. Now this is another film from 1959, and of course it's Japanese. Again, every film we've covered so far has been Japanese, but that will change soon. So 20 years after her disappearance, a woman returns to her household seemingly unaged, which is odd, and meanwhile, a vampire terrorizes the local community. You could probably put two and two together here, right? Now, the differences in mythology here, compared to Western vampires, is interesting to watch. These vampires are, for example, afraid of the moonlight more than anything else. Crosses transform them into statues, and there's a dwarf assistant as well. So it's pretty interesting off the bat. I think this film is nicely paced. The big negative I had is that there's a few hokey fisticuffs. Like we'll see in a few other Japanese horror films of this era. Sometimes you don't get enough of what you want, like the vampire stuff, and sometimes there's like some hokey human conflicts or fisticuffs, and you get some of that here, which kind of diminishes the impact of the film. But it's a decent flick. It's not one to concern yourself with if you can't find it, but it's a decent time waster. Again, same director of the Ghost of Yotsuya. I would check that one out first from him. Then if you like his style, you could try to find his lesser-known stuff. Now, Lady Vampire. Again, unfortunately, difficult to find. Some of these older films are. I'm sure I watched it probably on YouTube again. It was probably up temporarily. But I'm not really selling that one to you that much, so I wouldn't really bother following up until you've seen the director's other films. Now, next on our list is the first Filipino horror film that we're covering, and that is Terror is a Man from 1959. So this film was made in the Philippines. So it's about a mad scientist who transforms a panther into a man-like creature that escapes and goes on a murderous rampage. All right. Now we're cooking, right? Well, we've had a vampire film just now, so we're getting away a little bit from the samurai-type stuff, and now we're getting to some different things. So, this movie sounds like a boatload of fun, but it isn't. Okay? Sorry to build that one out for you and then just take it right away. I found this film to be very boring. It's got run-of-the-mill dialogue. There's not much else for close to about 70 minutes. There's this really lame escape attempt by the creature, and then we're subjected to even more boring dialogue before the mediocre finale. It is not a good film. I did not enjoy it. The Philippines, as we'll see, made a number of these humanoid monster movies during this era, some of which are good. This one is one of the least entertaining that I've seen. Ironically, sometimes I'll see this movie on best of lists on the internet. I'm really not getting it. Maybe I'm missing something, but man, just stay away. Now the next one. This one's a bit of a controversial opinion. Not super controversial, but I might get a little flack for this. We're talking about Jigoku from 1960. We're back to Japanese horror. So after getting involved with a hit-and-run car accident, a man and his acquaintances subsequently die and endure the pains of hell. Again, great premise. But man, did I hate this movie so much. This movie has its fans, and if you're a fan of it, I gotta apologize for lambasting it, because I'm gonna unleash just fury upon it. I really dislike this movie. Fair warning. Let's start with a few positives, though. So there is some gore that was a bit ahead of its time, and there are a few scenes with very nice imagery. There's some nice use of color in this movie. Everything else is just low-quality stuff. I mean, where to begin? The place to begin is the acting, which is the single worst aspect to this film. The acting in Jigoku consists of some of the most systematically awful performances I have ever seen. I mean, just horrible. The opening half hour, like the opening 30-minute setup, isn't too bad. It's a bit on the dull side, but after that, it just starts getting worse. And then the entire later half of the film, which actually takes place in hell, is basically just a train wreck. It just seems so artificial and unconvincing. I found the scares to be very cheap and ineffective. Some very lame deaths that we have to sit through. Some really cheap stunt dummies that are kind of unintentionally funny. Man, it's just... There's like a sequence where it shows close-ups of people screaming in hell, which should be like terrifying. But it's just, it's badly acted and annoying, and it's repetitive. It's like, come on, man. There's another scene. I'm not spoiling anything here. There's a particular scene where a character's running towards a giant wheel in slow motion, and it was bad. It was almost like they took like a 5-second clip and just ran it on rerun for like 12 times in a row. It's not good. The director here is our boy Nobuo Nakagawa again. I mean, we're covering this guy a lot. This is one of the worst films in his entire filmography that I've seen. But a lot of people seem to like this movie. If you look at its ratings by critics and viewers online, they kind of like it. I'm in the minority on this. I hate this movie. But, if you don't believe me, or our tastes are a little different, or you just want to check it out yourself, feel free. It's widely available on DVD. Check it out. But I'm not officially recommending it. So don't yell at me if you don't like it. Alright, so the next movie here we're covering in this video. The Ghost Story of Kakui Street, also known as Kaiden Kakui Dori. So Dori in Japanese I think means street, because I've seen that before. When I'm in Japan, it'll say something Dori, which is something street. Now, again, this is a period horror film. It's a Japanese film from 1961. It's a period horror film that features a haunted well and a blind masseuse and his vengeful ghost. So I viewed it without subtitles, but it's obvious that the masseuse was abrasive and confrontational to some of his customers, which ultimately resulted in his untimely demise. So most of the film concerns itself with the character interaction and setting up of the conflict, while the finale is really what's the horror-based element. Now, much of this film was shot at night in claustrophobic rooms with limited light. So I think that actually enhanced the experience. It creates kind of a claustrophobic mood to it. So this one is definitely a little bit more, it's different from some of the other samurai-era horror films that we're covering. So that actually lends an assertion that, even in a repetitive genre like samurai horror, there are some nuances in some movies that are pretty different than other ones. So I personally like this movie. It's a little different, maybe a little slow for many people, but I just liked its execution. Now the DVD availability, it's another one that's difficult to find. Write it down on your to-see list, see if it pops up on YouTube or on DVD sometime in the future. Next movie on this list, I do not have much to say about. That is The Ghost of Oiwa from 1961, Japanese horror film. This is one of the Yotsuya ghost story readaptations or remakes or whatever you want to call it. Unfortunately, it's one of the duller versions, because it moves at a snail's pace, and it fails to offer anything energetic or stimulating. It doesn't really set itself apart. It's just like a big cliche that doesn't make you remember it at all. Just watch The Ghost of Yotsuya. The next one on this list is one that's a little different here. That is Matango, Attack of the Mushroom People from 1962. Japanese horror movie. A film by Ishiro Honda, the director of Gojira and Half Human. This one's not as good as Gojira, but it is better than Half Human. So after getting washed ashore, a desolate island, a group of vacationers must choose to starve or eat dodgy mushrooms with horrific side effects. Another intriguing premise. This one kind of cashes in on it. It's slow moving, with more of an emphasis on the human conflicts amid the harsh circumstances than the actual monsters themselves. Again, there's some lean fisticuffs at times. Kind of takes you out of the film. However, the acting's pretty good. And some of the set designs are really effective. Like, if you're a fan of watching fungus and mushrooms on television, you're going to like this one. Because there's some cool shots of gigantic, fungus if you like that type of thing. I liked it. I don't know. Well, something a little different. The horror elements themselves are kind of a mixed bag, but I did find the ending to be pretty satisfying, and the film overall to have a pretty good entertainment value to it. It could have been better if they ramped up the horror elements with the mushrooms a little bit more, but I still think this one's pretty good. Now, Matango is widely available on DVD, so feel free to get that if you want to check it out. If you're a fan of the director, feel free. So we're at the end of part 1 of this 3-part video on Asian horror films made before 1970. Some interesting stuff here for sure. But I think the next 2 parts have even more interesting movies to cover. So be sure to join me as we continue our exploration of Asian horror during that period. So you can see, some of the trends that are developing with the samurai-themed horror films from Japan, which we've already covered a handful of them. Some are good, some are bad. There's also a nice mix of some other types of horror films that we've covered already, and we've only just begun. So, hey, as always, we'll see you next time.